The blizzard howled outside the walls of the small Montana cabin, but Lillian Ziegler couldn't hear it over the sound of her own coughing. Blood spattered her handkerchief, each drop a crimson testament to the consumption ravaging her lungs. The frontier doctor had given her until spring, but the brutal winter of 1875 threatened to claim her long before the first thaw. Zeke Daniels stomped the snow from his boots before entering the one-room shack where he'd brought the dying woman 3 weeks earlier. He'd found her half-frozen in an overturned stagecoach, the only survivor of an ambush that had claimed the lives of the driver and 2 other passengers. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and with another storm brewing, he'd had no choice but to bring her to his homestead. "You're looking better today," he lied, setting down a fresh bundle of firewood. The flames in the hearth had dwindled to embers, and the cabin felt like an icebox. Lillian tried to smile through pale, cracked lips. "We both know that's not true, Mr. Daniels." Her voice was barely above a whisper, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Zeke removed his gloves and hat, hanging them by the door before moving to stoke the fire. At 32, his face was weathered from years under the harsh prairie sun, but his eyes remained kind despite all he'd seen. The war between the states had claimed his youth, and the untamed frontier had hardened what remained, yet something about this woman's quiet dignity moved him. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small jar of honey and a book with a worn leather cover. "Found these at the trading post. The honey might help your throat, and I figured you might want something to read." Lillian's eyes brightened momentarily. At 26, she traveled west from Boston after the death of her parents, hoping the mountain air might improve her health. Instead, the journey had only hastened the disease's progress. "Jane Eyre," she read from the cover. "It's one of my favorites." "I wouldn't know," Zeke admitted. "Never was much for reading. My ma tried to teach me, but there wasn't much call for it when I was growing up." Lillian studied him with interest. Despite his rugged appearance and the pistol strapped to his hip, there was a gentleness to the cowboy that contradicted his imposing frame. "I could read it to you," she offered. "It might pass the time." Zeke nodded, trying not to let his concern show as another coughing fit racked her slender frame. When it subsided, he poured her a cup of water from the pitcher beside the bed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You've been very kind to a stranger." "Out here, kindness is all we've got sometimes," he replied, checking the bandage on her arm where a deep gash from the stagecoach accident was still healing. "Besides, you're not exactly a stranger anymore." As the winter deepened, Lillian grew weaker. The coughing fits became more frequent, her breathing more labored. The color drained from her face until she was as pale as the snow that imprisoned them. Zeke found himself taking fewer trips to hunt, afraid of what he might find upon his return. One particularly brutal night in January, as the wind threatened to tear the roof from the cabin, Lillian's fever spiked dangerously high. Zeke stayed awake, constantly replacing the cool compresses on her forehead, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "I'm dying, aren't I?" she asked during a moment of lucidity, her blue eyes unnaturally bright against her ashen skin. Zeke took her hand, surprised by how small and fragile it felt in his calloused palm. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Lillian tried to laugh, but it turned into another coughing fit. "I don't think even the famous Zeke Daniels can fight death itself." "Don't sell me short, Miss Ziegler. I've faced worse odds." "Have you now?" she asked, a hint of her former spirit flickering in her eyes. Zeke nodded, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Did I ever tell you about the time I was cornered by 3 Blackfoot warriors with nothing but a broken pistol and my wits?" She shook her head, and he launched into a tale that was only partially true, embellishing the details to keep her engaged. As he spoke, he noticed the corners of her mouth turn up slightly, and he silently vowed to give her a reason to smile every day she had left. The following morning, Zeke awoke in the chair to find Lillian watching him, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "Your fever broke," he said, relief washing over him. "It seems you're a better nurse than you let on," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. But they both knew this was merely a respite, not a recovery. The disease that gripped her lungs would not surrender so easily. Still, Zeke seized upon this moment of improvement to bring her broth made from a rabbit he'd trapped the day before. As January gave way to February, Lillian continued to read from Jane Eyre each evening. Zeke found himself looking forward to these moments, sitting by the fire as her soft voice gave life to characters he'd never imagined. Sometimes, when the pain was too great for her to continue, he would take the book and stumble through the words himself, determined to give her some distraction from her suffering. One evening, as a rare moment of sunshine broke through the perpetual cloud cover, Zeke helped Lillian to the door of the cabin. Wrapped in blankets, she took her first breath of fresh air in over a month. "It's beautiful," she whispered, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, pristine and untouched as far as the eye could see. The sun cast long shadows across the drifts, painting the world in shades of gold and blue. "It can be," Zeke agreed, "when it's not trying to kill you." Lillian leaned against him, too weak to stand on her own. "I never thought I'd die in a place like this." "You're not dying," Zeke said firmly. "You're just resting until you get your strength back." She looked up at him, her eyes sad but gentle. "We both know that's not true." "What I know," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "is that spring is coming. The wildflowers in these parts are something to behold, blues and yellows stretching as far as you can see." "I would like to see that," she admitted. Zeke swallowed hard, fighting against the tightness in his throat. "Then you will. We'll see the spring together. I promise you that." As February crawled on, Lillian's moments of improvement became fewer and further between. The book remained unfinished, as she lacked the breath to read more than a page at a time. Zeke began to supplement their dwindling supplies with pine needle tea, rich in the vitamins the doctor had once told him might help fight consumption. One morning, Zeke awoke to find Lillian standing at the small window, her nightgown hanging loosely on her emaciated frame. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pink glow across the snow. "You shouldn't be up," he scolded gently, moving to her side. "I heard something," she said, pointing toward a stand of pine trees at the edge of the clearing. "Look." Zeke followed her gaze and spotted a deer, its breath forming clouds in the cold morning air as it cautiously stepped through the deep snow. Behind it, a fawn picked its way carefully in its mother's tracks. "Life finds a way, even in the harshest conditions," Lillian murmured, leaning against him for support. Zeke nodded, wrapping an arm around her waist to steady her. He could feel every rib beneath his fingers, a stark reminder of how much weight she'd lost. That it does. Later that day, as Lillian slept, Zeke saddled his horse and rode to a nearby ridge where he knew wild onions sometimes pushed through the snow in late winter. He returned with a handful of the small bulbs, along with some pine bark and the last of his coffee beans. He brewed a concoction that smelled terrible, but that his grandmother had sworn could cure anything from rheumatism to yellow fever. "I'm not drinking that," Lillian protested when he offered her the steaming mug. "Sure you are," he insisted. "My grandma was half Cherokee, said this brew saved her whole village during a bad winter." "Was that before or after they all lost their sense of taste?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. Zeke laughed, surprised by her humor despite her condition. "Probably after. Come on now, just try it, for me." With a sigh, Lillian accepted the mug and took a small sip, her face contorted in disgust, but she managed to swallow. "That is possibly the most vile thing I've ever tasted." "That means it's working," Zeke said with a wink. To his amazement, Lillian finished the entire mug, grimacing with each swallow. When she handed it back to him, their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you," she said, her eyes holding his. "Not just for the medicine, but for everything." Zeke found himself at a loss for words, unaccustomed to the feelings stirring within him. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to care for someone else, to fear for them, to hope for them. "Get some rest," he finally said, turning away to hide the emotion on his face. "I'll make some more of that brew tomorrow." "I can hardly wait," she replied dryly, but he caught the small smile that played across her lips as she settled back against the pillows. That night, a new storm swept in from the mountains, bringing with it temperatures cold enough to freeze a man's breath in his beard. Zeke spent hours feeding the fire, determined not to let the temperature in the cabin drop. When he finally crawled into his bedroll on the floor, exhaustion claimed him immediately. He dreamed of spring, of wildflowers and warm breezes, of Lillian with color in her cheeks and strength in her step. In his dream, she was laughing, her hair loose around her shoulders as she walked through a meadow beside him. Zeke woke with a start, unsure what had disturbed his sleep, until he heard it again, Lillian gasping for breath. He scrambled to her side, finding her clutching her chest, her lips tinged blue in the dim firelight. "Lillian," he called, taking her hand. "Breathe with me, slow and steady." Her eyes, wide with panic, locked onto his as she struggled to follow his example. Gradually, her breathing eased, though each inhalation seemed to cause her pain. "I thought I was drowning," she whispered when she could speak again. "I could feel the fluid in my lungs." Zeke's heart sank. He knew the signs. His sister had died of consumption when he was 14. The fluid filling the lungs was often the final stage. "You're going to be fine," he lied, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Try to sleep." "Will you stay?" she asked, her fingers tightening around his. "I don't want to be alone." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, settling onto the edge of the bed. "I'll be right here when you wake up." Lillian closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady. Zeke watched the rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath as if by doing so he could ensure there would always be another. As the night wore on, Zeke found himself praying again, more fervently than he had in years. Not for salvation or forgiveness, but for time, just a little more time with this woman who had unexpectedly become so important to him. The storm passed, but Lillian's condition continued to deteriorate. The brief rallies became shorter, the periods of weakness longer. Zeke began to measure the days by small victories. A spoonful of broth consumed, a moment of clarity in her eyes, the sound of her voice, however faint. One afternoon in late February, as Zeke was chopping wood outside, he heard a sound that made him drop his axe. Lillian was singing. The melody drifted through the cabin walls, soft and slightly off-key, but unmistakably a lullaby. He stood motionless, afraid that any movement might break the spell. When he finally entered the cabin, he found her sitting up in bed, a faraway look in her eyes. "My mother used to sing that to me," she explained when she noticed him watching. "I was thinking of her and suddenly remembered the tune." "It's beautiful," Zeke said, setting down the wood he'd carried in. "You have a nice voice." Lillian laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Now I know you're lying. I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, even before my lungs betrayed me." Zeke smiled, pulling his chair closer to the bed. "Maybe not, but I still like hearing it." She studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "You're a strange man, Zeke Daniels. Most would have left me to die in that stagecoach, or at best, dumped me at the nearest settlement." "I'm not most men," he replied simply. "No," she agreed, reaching out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar that ran along his jawline. "You certainly are not." Zeke felt his breath catch at her touch. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such gentleness. Without thinking, he turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss to the center of it. Lillian's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she moved her hand to the back of his neck, drawing him closer until their foreheads touched. "This is madness," Zeke whispered, his heart pounding. "You're sick and I'm a good man," she interrupted. "Perhaps the best I've ever known." Before he could respond, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss so soft it was barely more than a breath. Zeke remained perfectly still, afraid that the slightest movement might shatter this moment or worse, harm her in some way. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, but not with fever. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she admitted. "So have I," Zeke confessed, taking her hand in his. "But you need to rest to save your strength." Lillian's smile faded slightly. "For what, Zeke?" "We both know I'm running out of time." "Don't say that," he said sharply. "Spring is almost here, you just need to hold on a little longer." She looked as though she wanted to argue, but instead she nodded. "Then I will try for you." That night, Zeke slept in the chair beside her bed, their hands intertwined. He woke several times to check on her, relief washing over him each time he found her still breathing. By morning, he had made a decision. "I'm riding to Fort Harrison," he announced as he prepared a thin porridge for their breakfast. "There's an army doctor there who might be able to help." Lillian looked alarmed. "That's at least 2 days' ride in this weather. You can't go alone." "I don't have a choice," Zeke replied, his tone brooking no argument. "You need medicine, real medicine, not just my grandmother's remedies." "And if the doctor can't help?" she asked softly. Zeke set the bowl down with more force than necessary. "Then I'll find someone who can. There are specialists in Helena who have studied consumption. Someone must know something that will help." Lillian watched him with sad eyes. "Zeke, please, don't leave, not now." He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside the bed to take her face in his hands. "Listen to me, Lillian Ziegler. I am not going to watch you die, not when there might be something I can do to prevent it." "And what if I die while you're gone?" she countered, her voice breaking. "What if these are my last days and I spend them alone?" Zeke's resolve faltered. The thought of her dying alone in this cabin, miles from anyone, was unbearable. But so was the thought of doing nothing while the life slowly drained from her. 3 days, he finally said. "I'll be back in 3 days with medicine or a doctor or both, I swear it." Lillian seemed to search his face for a moment before nodding. 3 days. I'll hold you to that, Cowboy." Zeke prepared for the journey meticulously, ensuring Lillian had enough wood, water, and food within reach. He left his pistol on the table beside her bed, showing her how to use it should the need arise. "I've never fired a gun," she admitted, holding the weapon gingerly. "Let's hope you won't have to," Zeke replied, but he made her practice cocking the hammer and checking that it was loaded nonetheless. Just in case. As he saddled his horse in the gray light of dawn, Lillian stood in the doorway, wrapped in blankets against the cold. She looked so frail that Zeke nearly abandoned his plan altogether. 3 days, she reminded him, attempting a brave smile. Zeke mounted his horse and rode close to the cabin, leaning down to kiss her one last time. 3 days, he confirmed. "And when I return, we'll finish that book together." The journey to Fort Harrison was grueling. A fresh snowfall had obscured the trail, and Zeke had to navigate by landmarks and instinct. The temperature dropped steadily as the day progressed, forcing him to dismount periodically and walk alongside his horse to maintain circulation in his extremities. By nightfall, he had covered less than half the distance he'd hoped. He made camp in a small grove of trees, building a fire large enough to ward off both the cold and any curious predators. As he huddled close to the flames, his thoughts returned to Lillian. Was she warm enough? Had she managed to eat? Was she even still alive? The last question sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. He hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might die before he returned. The thought was too painful to contemplate. Morning brought clearer skies but even colder temperatures. Zeke's beard was stiff with ice as he broke camp and continued his journey. His horse struggled through drifts that sometimes reached its chest, but the animal was Montana bred and as stubborn as its master. By mid-afternoon of the second day, Fort Harrison came into view, its wooden palisade a welcome sight against the stark white landscape. Zeke urged his exhausted mount forward, hope giving him a second wind. The sentries at the gate eyed him suspiciously until he explained his purpose. One of them, a young private with a sympathetic face, escorted him directly to the infirmary. Dr. James Holloway was a grizzled veteran of both the Civil War and the frontier. His hands, spotted with age, were steady as he listened to Zeke's description of Lillian's symptoms. Consumption, without a doubt, the doctor confirmed, gathering supplies into a medical bag. And advanced, from what you're telling me. I'm surprised she's lasted this long, especially in these conditions. She's stronger than she looks, Zeke said defensively, Doctor. Holloway nodded, his expression grave. She'd have to be, but I won't lie to you, Mr. Daniels. The prognosis isn't good. Consumption is a death sentence, especially out here. But there must be something you can do, Zeke insisted. Some medicine or treatment. The doctor sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. I can give her laudanum for the pain, powders to reduce the fever, and a tonic that might ease her breathing. But a cure? No, I'm afraid not. Medical science hasn't advanced that far yet. Zeke felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He'd ridden all this way, left Lillian alone, for nothing more than palliative care. However, the doctor continued, seeming to sense Zeke's despair, I've seen cases where patients have gone into remission. It's rare, but it happens. Good nutrition, fresh air, rest, these things can sometimes allow the body to heal itself. And the spring air, Zeke asked, grasping at any hope. I've heard that can help. It can't hurt, Dr. Holloway admitted. The warm, dry air of summer is particularly beneficial. If she can make it that long. He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. She will, Zeke said firmly. She has to. The doctor agreed to accompany Zeke back to his cabin, a gesture that both surprised and relieved him. They set out at first light the next morning, the doctor riding a sturdy army mule and carrying saddlebags filled with medicines and supplies. The return journey was even more arduous than the outbound trip. A fresh storm slowed their progress, reducing visibility to mere feet at times. Zeke pushed forward relentlessly, his fear for Lillian growing with each passing hour. They arrived at the cabin as dusk was falling on the third day, exactly as Zeke had promised. His heart raced as he approached, scanning for smoke from the chimney. A thin wisp rose against the darkening sky and relief flooded through him. Lillian, he called as he dismounted, rushing to the door. It's Zeke, I've brought a doctor. There was no response. Zeke pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in the silence. The fire was barely more than embers, casting long shadows across the room. And there in the bed lay Lillian, her eyes closed, her face as pale as the snow outside. No, Zeke breathed, crossing the room in 2 strides. Lillian, wake up, please wake up. He took her hand, alarmed by how cold it felt. But then, miraculously, her fingers twitched and her eyelids fluttered open. You came back, she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean close to hear it. I promised I would, Zeke replied, his voice thick with emotion. And I brought help. Dr. Holloway approached the bed, his experienced eyes taking in Lillian's condition with a single glance. Without a word, he began his examination, his movements efficient but gentle. Zeke busied himself building up the fire and heating water, trying not to hover as the doctor worked. When Dr. Holloway finally stepped away from the bed, his expression was grim. She's very weak, he said quietly, leading Zeke to the far side of the cabin. The disease has progressed significantly. Her right lung is almost completely compromised and the left is beginning to show signs as well. But you can help her, Zeke said, his tone making it more of a statement than a question. The doctor hesitated. I can make her comfortable, ease her breathing somewhat, but Mr. Daniels, I need you to understand the reality of the situation. This young woman is dying. Zeke shook his head, refusing to accept the doctor's prognosis. No, she just needs to make it to spring. The warm air will help her lungs heal. Dr. Holloway placed a hand on Zeke's shoulder, his eyes compassionate but direct. Spring won't cure consumption. It might provide some temporary relief, but the disease will continue its course. I'm sorry, but it's only a matter of time. How much time? Zeke demanded, his voice breaking. A few weeks, perhaps a month if she's very lucky, the doctor replied honestly. Enough time to get her affairs in order to say goodbye. Zeke turned away, unwilling to let the doctor see the tears that threatened to spill. He had faced death many times on the battlefield, in skirmishes with hostile tribes, even in the jaws of a grizzly once, but never had it seemed so cruel as now. "I'll leave you with medicines and detailed instructions," Dr. Holloway continued after a moment. "I can stay tonight, but I must return to the fort tomorrow." Zeke nodded numbly, unable to form words. The doctor moved back to Lillian's side, administering a dose of laudanum to ease her pain and help her sleep. Zeke watched as her features relaxed, the lines of suffering smoothing from her brow. Later, as Lillian slept and the doctor dozed in the chair, Zeke stepped outside into the bitter night. The stars shone with cruel brightness in the clear sky, indifferent to the suffering below. He tilted his head back, a wordless cry of rage and grief escaping his lips. When he returned to the cabin, Dr. Holloway was awake, warming his hands by the fire. "She's resting comfortably," he informed Zeke. "The laudanum will help with the pain, and the other medicines may ease her symptoms somewhat." "Thank you," Zeke said, the words inadequate but all he could offer. The doctor nodded, studying Zeke with shrewd eyes. "May I ask how long you've known Miss Ziegler?" "About 2 months," Zeke admitted. "I found her after a stagecoach accident brought her here to recover." "And yet you're willing to go to such lengths for her," the doctor observed. "Riding through a blizzard to fetch help for a woman you barely know." Zeke met the doctor's gaze steadily. "I know enough." Dr. Holloway's expression softened. "I see. Well, in that case, I have one more piece of advice for you, Mr. Daniels. Make these final days count. Give her reasons to smile, moments of joy to counterbalance the suffering. Sometimes, that's the best medicine we can offer." The following morning, the doctor departed with a promise to return in 2 weeks if weather permitted. Zeke stood in the doorway watching until the older man disappeared from view, then turned back to Lillian, who was awake and sitting up slightly in bed. "He doesn't think I'm going to make it," she stated simply, her perceptiveness undiminished by her illness. Zeke considered lying but found he couldn't, not to her. "No, he doesn't," Lillian nodded, accepting this information with remarkable composure. "And what do you think?" "I think," Zeke said carefully, "that doctors don't know everything. I've seen men survive wounds that should have killed them, and others die from scratches that seemed insignificant. The human spirit is a powerful thing, Lillian." A small smile curved her lips. "Is that your way of telling me not to give up?" "It's my way of telling you that I haven't," he replied, sitting beside her on the bed and taking her hand. "And I won't, no matter what some army doctor says." Lillian's eyes welled with tears. "Zeke, I don't want you to watch me die. It's not fair to you. Perhaps when the weather improves, you could take me to Helena, find a sanatorium or no," he interrupted firmly. "You're staying right here with me. We're going to see the spring together, just like I promised." She looked as though she wanted to argue further, but a coughing fit seized her, leaving her gasping and weak. Zeke helped her drink some water, then administered the medicine the doctor had left, measuring the drops carefully according to the instructions. As the days passed, Zeke devoted himself entirely to Lillian's care. He cooked broths rich with whatever nutrients he could find, read to her when she was too weak to hold the book herself, and even attempted to sing when she expressed a fondness for old hymns, though his voice was rough and untrained. Despite the doctor's grim prognosis, Lillian seemed to stabilize somewhat under Zeke's constant attention. The medicines helped control the coughing fits, and the laudanum allowed her to sleep through the night without pain. There were even moments when her eyes shone with their former brightness, and her laugh, though softer now, filled the cabin with warmth. During one lucid afternoon, as weak sunshine filtered through the cabin's single window, Lillian asked Zeke about his life before Montana. "Not much to tell," he said with a shrug, whittling a small wooden figure as he sat beside her bed. "Grew up in Tennessee, fought for the Confederacy even though my family didn't own slaves, drifted west after the war like a lot of men who didn't have anything to go home to." "And your family?" She pressed gently, Zeke's hands stilled. "Pa died when I was young. Ma raised us, me and my sister Sarah, until the consumption took her too. Sarah followed a few years later, same disease. Understanding dawned in Lillian's eyes. That's why you're so determined to save me. You couldn't save them. Zeke resumed his whittling, his movements more aggressive than before. Maybe, or maybe I just don't like the idea of a world without you in it, even though I've only known you a short time. Tell me about your dreams, Lillian said after a moment, changing the subject. What does Zeke Daniels want from life? He considered the question, realizing it had been years since he'd thought beyond basic survival. Land of my own, I suppose. Not just this cabin, but a proper ranch. Cattle, horses, maybe some crops. A place that's mine that no one can take away. And a family, she asked quietly. Zeke met her gaze, his heart pounding. Once, maybe. I hadn't thought about it much lately, until now. Lillian looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm sorry, Zeke, I can't give you that future. You don't know that, he insisted, setting aside his carving to take her hand. The doctor could be wrong, you could recover. And if I don't, she challenged, her voice stronger than it had been in days. What then? Will you resent me for making you care only to leave you? Zeke shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. I could never resent you, Lillian, not for a single moment we've shared, even though it will bring you pain. Some things are worth the pain, he said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by another coughing fit, this one worse than any that had come before. Blood flecked Lillian's lips when it finally subsided, and fear clouded her eyes. It's getting worse, she whispered. Zeke increased her dosage of medicine slightly, as the doctor had instructed for severe episodes. It's just a bad day. Tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow wasn't better, nor was the day after that. Lillian's condition deteriorated rapidly, her breathing becoming more labored, her periods of lucidity shorter. Zeke barely slept, afraid that she might slip away while he was unconscious. One night, as a fierce wind rattled the cabin's shutters, Lillian woke suddenly, her eyes wide with panic. Zeke, she gasped, reaching for him. He was at her side instantly, taking her outstretched hand. I'm here. I had a dream, she said, her voice surprisingly clear. I was in a meadow filled with wildflowers. The sun was warm on my face and I could breathe, Zeke. I could fill my lungs completely without pain. Zeke smiled, brushing hair from her forehead. That wasn't a dream, that was a glimpse of spring when you're better. Lillian shook her head slightly. No, it was something else, a memory of what was or a vision of what will be after. She trailed off, unwilling to speak the words. After nothing, Zeke said firmly. That meadow exists just a few miles from here, and I'm going to take you there when the snow melts. She studied his face in the dim firelight, her expression softening. You really believe that, don't you? With everything I am, he confirmed, Lillian's eyes filled with tears. Then I will try to believe it too. As February gave way to March, there were subtle signs of the changing season. The days grew incrementally longer, the sunlight a touch warmer. The snow began to develop a crust during the day that partially melted, only to refreeze at night. Birds that had wintered further south began to return, their songs a promise of renewal. Zeke pointed out each of these changes to Lillian, using them as evidence that spring was indeed coming, that she only needed to hold on a little longer. She listened with a smile, though whether she believed him or was simply humoring him, he couldn't tell. One morning, as Zeke returned from chopping wood, he found Lillian sitting up in bed, looking through a small leather-bound book he hadn't seen before. "What's that?" he asked, setting down the firewood. "My journal," she replied. "I found it in my trunk. I'd forgotten I had it with me." Zeke moved closer, curious. "May I see?" Lillian hesitated only briefly before handing it to him. "It's nothing profound, just my thoughts and observations." The journal was filled with Lillian's neat handwriting, entries dating back to her departure from Boston. Zeke skimmed the pages, smiling at her descriptions of the landscapes she'd passed through, the people she'd met on her journey west. And then he found the entries from after the stagecoach accident, after he'd brought her to his cabin. With growing wonder, he read her impressions of him, her gradual shift from wariness to trust to something deeper. "You wrote about me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Lillian blushed slightly. "You saved my life. Of course I wrote about you." Zeke continued reading, his heart pounding as he came to an entry dated just a few weeks earlier. "I find myself thinking of Zeke constantly, wondering what might have been if we'd met under different circumstances. If I weren't dying, if we had time." He closed the journal, unable to read more. "Lillian, I don't," she interrupted gently. "Please don't say it, not now. It would be too cruel knowing what we can't have." Zeke set the journal aside and knelt beside the bed, taking her face in his hands. "Listen to me. I don't care what the doctor said or what you believe. I am not saying goodbye to you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever if I can help it." "Zeke, no," he cut her off, his voice fierce with determination. "You came into my life for a reason, Lillian Ziegler, and I refuse to believe it was just so I could watch you die. That's not how our story ends." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she placed her hands over his. "Then how does it end?" "With spring," he said simply. "With wild flowers and sunshine and you breathing easily at last." For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes, and she leaned forward to press her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, and something that might have been love if given time to grow. The promised visit from Dr. Holloway never materialized. A messenger from the fort arrived instead, bearing news that the doctor had been called away to deal with an outbreak of influenza among the Blackfoot. He had sent additional medicines, however, along with a letter expressing his regrets and his surprise that Lillian was still alive. "See," Zeke said after reading the letter aloud, "even the doctor is amazed by your strength." Lillian managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Or perhaps he simply underestimated your stubbornness in keeping me alive." As March progressed, the snow began to melt in earnest, revealing patches of brown grass and dormant wildflowers. The creek that had been frozen solid all winter began to flow again, its gentle gurgling a constant backdrop to their days. One afternoon, while Lillian napped, Zeke ventured further from the cabin than he had in weeks, following the creek to where it widened into a small pond. To his delight, he found the first wildflowers of the season, tiny purple crocuses pushing through the last remnants of snow. Carefully, he gathered a small bouquet and hurried back to the cabin, eager to show Lillian this tangible proof of spring's arrival. He found her awake, propped up against the pillows, her face turned toward the window. "Look what I found," he said, presenting the flowers with a flourish. Lillian's face lit up, a genuine smile spreading across her features. "They're beautiful." She reached out to touch the delicate petals, her fingers trembling slightly. "Spring really is coming. Just as I promised," Zeke replied, placing the flowers in a tin cup filled with water beside her bed. "And there will be more soon. Bluebells, Indian paintbrush, lupines, they'll cover the hillsides like a patchwork quilt." For the first time in weeks, Lillian's eyes shone with something other than fever or pain. "I would very much like to see that." "And you will," Zeke assured her, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "We'll see it together." That night, as a gentle rain fell outside, washing away more of the winter's remnants, Zeke finished reading the final pages of Jane Eyre aloud. When he closed the book, he found Lillian watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "What?" he asked, self-conscious under her scrutiny. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "that I've never been happier than I am right now in this moment, despite everything." Zeke set the book aside, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "Is that so?" Lillian nodded, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "When I left Boston, I was so afraid of dying alone, afraid of suffering. I never imagined I would find someone like you at the end of my journey." "This isn't the end," Zeke insisted, catching her hand and pressing it to his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "This is just the beginning." "Zeke," she began, her expression troubled, "there's something I need to ask you." "Anything," he promised. Lillian took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain it caused. "If, when the time comes, I don't want to be alone, will you hold me?" The question struck Zeke like a physical blow. He wanted to protest, to insist again that she wasn't dying, that spring would bring healing. But the quiet dignity in her eyes stopped him. "Yes," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I'll hold you, but not yet, Lillian, not for a long time yet," she smiled, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you." The following day brought more rain, washing away the last of the snow from the clearing around the cabin. When the clouds finally parted, revealing a sky of brilliant blue, Zeke made a decision. "Let's go outside," he suggested, already gathering blankets to wrap around Lillian. "The air is fresh and the sun is warm, it might do you good." Lillian hesitated, clearly uncertain whether she had the strength for even such a modest adventure. "I don't know if I can walk that far." "You don't have to," Zeke assured her. "I'll carry you." Before she could protest further, he scooped her into his arms, blankets and all, marveling at how little she weighed. Carefully, he carried her out of the cabin and into the sunshine, setting her gently on a chair he'd positioned earlier. Lillian closed her eyes, turning her face up to the sun. "Oh," she breathed, a sound of pure pleasure. "It's wonderful." Zeke watched her, his heart swelling with a complex mixture of emotions. She looked so fragile, so ethereal in the bright light, yet there was a strength in her that continued to amaze him. Despite everything, she still found joy in simple pleasures: the warmth of the sun, the sound of birdsong, the sight of new growth pushing through the soil. "Look there," he said, pointing to where green shoots were emerging along the edge of the clearing. "Those will be daisies in a few weeks." Lillian followed his gaze, a smile spreading across her face. "And over there?" she asked, indicating another patch of new growth. "Wild onions, I think," Zeke replied, moving closer to examine them. "And beyond those, if I'm not mistaken, the beginnings of lupines." They spent an hour outside, Zeke pointing out signs of spring while Lillian listened attentively, her expression brightening with each new discovery. When she finally began to tire, he carried her back inside, settling her carefully on the bed. "Thank you," she said, her voice weak but her eyes shining. "That was the best medicine I've had in months." "We'll do it again tomorrow," Zeke promised, "and the day after that if the weather holds." True to his word, Zeke carried Lillian outside whenever the weather permitted over the next week. Each day, she seemed to absorb strength from the sun and the fresh air, sitting up a little straighter, staying out a little longer. One particularly warm afternoon, as they watched a pair of bluebirds building a nest in a nearby pine tree, Lillian turned to Zeke with an unexpected request. "I want to wash my hair," she announced. "It's been so long and I feel unclean." Zeke hesitated, concerned about her strength, but the determination in her eyes convinced him. "All right, but we'll do it my way." He positioned her chair near the fire inside the cabin, then filled a basin with warm water. With gentle hands, he helped her lean back, supporting her neck as he poured water over her long hair. She sighed with pleasure as he worked a small amount of soap into a lather, his fingers massaging her scalp with surprising tenderness. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, eyes closed in contentment. "I used to help my sister when she was ill," Zeke replied, carefully rinsing the soap away. "She said I had a gentle touch for a rough cowboy." Lillian smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. She was right. When her hair was clean and towel dried, Zeke combed it carefully, working out the tangles with patient strokes. The simple act of grooming seemed to restore something in Lillian, a sense of normalcy, perhaps, or dignity. "There," he said when he'd finished, "beautiful as ever." Lillian blushed, touching her hair self-consciously. "I doubt that very much. I must look like a ghost." "No," Zeke said firmly, turning her to face the small mirror he'd hung on the wall. "You look like a woman who's fighting harder than anyone I've ever known, and winning." Lillian studied her reflection, her expression thoughtful. The person looking back at her was undeniably gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark circles beneath her eyes. But there was color in her face that hadn't been there before, a spark of life that the disease hadn't yet extinguished. "Maybe," she conceded, "just maybe you're right." That night, for the first time since her collapse after Zeke's return from Fort Harrison, Lillian declined the laudanum. I want to be clear-headed, she explained when he offered the drops. The pain isn't so bad tonight. They sat together by the fire, Lillian wrapped in blankets in the chair while Zeke sat on the floor beside her, his head resting against her knee. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the crackling of the flames and the occasional call of an owl outside. "Zeke," Lillian said after a while, her voice soft but steady, "I need to tell you something." He looked up at her, alarmed by the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you feeling worse?" "No," she assured him, running her fingers through his hair in a soothing gesture. "Actually, I think I'm feeling better than I have in weeks. But that's not what I wanted to say." Zeke waited, his heart pounding with inexplicable apprehension. "I love you," Lillian said simply, the words hanging in the air between them like a fragile, precious thing. "I know it's foolish, given our situation. I know it only makes everything harder. But I couldn't bear the thought of never saying it aloud." For a moment, Zeke couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion her words had unleashed. Then he rose to his knees, taking her face in his hands with a reverence that made her breath catch. "Lillian Ziegler," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "loving you is the least foolish thing I've ever done. It's the only thing that makes sense in a world that's often senseless and cruel. And I will love you until my last breath, whether that's tomorrow or 50 years from now." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned forward to press her forehead against his. "I wish we had more time." "We will," he promised, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I can feel it, Lillian. You're getting stronger every day. The spring air is healing your lungs just as I said it would." She didn't contradict him, but neither did she agree. Instead, she kissed him, a kiss that spoke of longing and fear and hope all mingled together. That night, Zeke didn't sleep on his bedroll by the fire as he usually did. Instead, at Lillian's quiet request, he lay beside her on the narrow bed, holding her close as if he could somehow transfer his own vitality into her failing body. She fit perfectly against him, her back to his chest, his arm draped protectively around her waist. "Is this all right?" he asked, worried about causing her discomfort. "It's perfect," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "I've never felt safer." Zeke lay awake long after Lillian's breathing had deepened and slowed, listening to the sound of it, counting each inhalation and exhalation as if they were precious gems. He allowed himself, just for a moment, to imagine a future where they did this every night, falling asleep together, waking up together, building a life in this wild, beautiful land. The thought both sustained and tormented him, a dream that seemed increasingly possible yet still so fragile. Dawn brought a morning of startling beauty. Sunlight streamed through the cabin window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in its golden rays. Lillian still slept, her breathing deeper and more regular than it had been in weeks. Zeke watched her for a long moment, hope swelling in his chest. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he slipped from the bed and moved to the door, stepping outside to assess the day. The air was mild, with just a hint of lingering winter crispness. Birds called to one another from the trees, and the creek gurgled merrily, swollen with snowmelt from the higher elevations. And there, along the edge of the clearing, a miracle, the first blooms of wild iris, their purple petals unfurling in the morning light. Zeke knelt beside them, touching one gently as if to confirm it was real. "Spring," he whispered, a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought this moment to pass. When he returned to the cabin, Lillian was awake, sitting up in bed with her hair loose around her shoulders and color in her cheeks that hadn't been there the day before. "Good morning," she greeted him, her voice stronger than he'd heard it in months. "Good morning," he replied, unable to keep the smile from his face. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, sounding surprised by her own assessment. "Much better, actually. My chest doesn't feel as tight and the pain is less." Zeke crossed to her side, placing a hand on her forehead. "No fever either." "What is that smile for?" she asked, studying his expression with curious eyes. "Come and see," he said, already gathering blankets to wrap around her. "I have something to show you." This time, Lillian insisted on trying to walk, though she leaned heavily on Zeke's arm. Her steps were unsteady but determined as they made their way slowly to the door and out into the sunshine. When she saw the wild iris, she gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Zeke, they're beautiful." "Just the beginning," he promised, supporting her as she knelt to examine the flowers more closely. "In a few weeks, this whole clearing will be a riot of color." Lillian looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Do you really think I'll be here to see it?" Instead of answering directly, Zeke knelt beside her, taking both her hands in his. "Lillian Ziegler, will you marry me?" The question caught her completely off guard. She stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Zeke, you can't, we can," he insisted. "I love you, you love me, the rest is just details." "But my health is improving every day," he finished for her. "And even if it weren't, even if we only had a month or a week or a day together as husband and wife, I would still want to marry you." Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but they were accompanied by a smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Zeke Daniels." He pulled her into his arms, careful not to hold her too tightly, mindful of her fragility. "As soon as you're a bit stronger, I'll ride to the settlement and fetch the preacher." "It won't be a fancy wedding, it will be perfect," Lillian interrupted, her face alight with joy. "Just us, under the open sky with these wildflowers as witnesses." Over the next few days, Lillian's improvement continued, small but steady. She began to eat more, her appetite returning along with her strength. The coughing fits became less frequent, though they didn't disappear entirely. Each morning, she walked a little further, leaning less heavily on Zeke's arm with each passing day. Dr. Holloway finally returned, arriving unannounced one afternoon as Zeke was teaching Lillian how to fish in the creek. The doctor's surprise at finding his patient not only alive but sitting outdoors was evident in his expression. "Miss Ziegler," he greeted her, dismounting from his mule. "I must say, you're looking considerably better than when I last saw you." "I feel better, doctor," she replied, offering him a smile. "The spring air seems to agree with me." Dr. Holloway examined her thoroughly back in the cabin, his professional demeanor not quite hiding his astonishment at what he found. "Your right lung is still severely compromised," he admitted, "but the left shows signs of improvement. The fluid has decreased significantly." "Is she recovering?" Zeke asked, barely daring to hope. The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I wouldn't go that far. Consumption doesn't simply disappear, but she appears to be experiencing a remission of sorts, which is not unheard of, particularly in younger patients who receive proper care." "How long could such a remission last?" Lillian asked, her hand finding Zeke's and holding tight. "Impossible to say," Dr. Holloway replied honestly. "Weeks, months, occasionally years. Every case is different. And the disease will eventually return," Zeke pressed, needing to understand fully what they were facing. The doctor nodded gravely. "In most cases, yes. But medical science is advancing rapidly. New treatments are being developed. In a few years, who knows what might be possible?" After the doctor departed, promising to return in a month to check on Lillian's progress, Zeke found her standing by the window, her expression pensive. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "That I've been given a gift," she replied softly. "Time I didn't think I would have. A chance to live, even if it's just for a little while longer." Zeke wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "We'll make the most of every day, starting with our wedding," she suggested, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart race. "As soon as you feel strong enough," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Lillian turned in his arms, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "I feel strong enough today." The following week, Zeke rode to the settlement and returned with not only the preacher, but also a simple white dress he'd purchased from the general store and a gold band that had once belonged to his mother. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, was initially hesitant about performing the ceremony when he learned of Lillian's condition. but her obvious improvement and the devotion between the couple soon convinced him. They were married on a perfect spring morning, standing beside the creek where wild iris and early lupines created a natural altar. Lillian wore the white dress, which hung loosely on her still thin frame, and flowers in her hair. Zeke had shaved his beard and donned his one good shirt, his usually weathered face softened by the smile he couldn't suppress. "In sickness and in health," Zeke vowed, his voice strong and sure as he slipped the ring onto Lillian's finger. "Until death parts us and beyond." "With all that I am, for as long as I have," Lillian promised in return, tears of joy streaming down her face when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Zeke kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his fear of hurting her and his desperate love. The small group of settlers who had accompanied the preacher from town applauded, touched by the obvious devotion between the unlikely couple. After a simple celebration featuring food the townswomen had prepared, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the golden light of late afternoon. Zeke carried Lillian across the threshold of the cabin, now their shared home in truth as well as practice. "Mrs. Daniels," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "How does it sound?" "Like a dream come true," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. That night, they consummated their marriage with exquisite care, Zeke treating Lillian as if she were made of the finest porcelain, constantly attuned to her breathing, stopping at the slightest sign of distress. But Lillian surprised him with her passion, her newfound strength allowing her to participate fully in their union. "I love you," she whispered afterward, nestled against his chest as moonlight spilled through the window. "I never thought I would find this kind of happiness." "Nor I," Zeke admitted, stroking her hair. "I had resigned myself to a solitary life, and then you quite literally crashed into it." Lillian laughed softly, the sound like music to his ears. "Divine intervention." "Something like that," he agreed, pulling her closer. "Now sleep, wife. Tomorrow is the first day of our new life together." As spring gave way to summer, Lillian continued to improve. Her strength returned gradually, allowing her to take on light household duties and even help with the garden Zeke planted behind the cabin. The coughing fits became rare, though they never disappeared completely, a reminder of the shadow that still loomed over their happiness. Dr. Holloway visited monthly, each time expressing cautious optimism at Lillian's progress. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," he advised. The mountain air, the diet, the happiness, it's all contributing to her improvement. In July, they traveled to Helena, where Zeke arranged for Lillian to see a specialist who had studied consumption in Europe. The doctor confirmed Dr. Holloway's assessment. Lillian was experiencing a significant remission, though the disease remained present in her lungs. "Live fully, Mrs. Daniels," the specialist advised. "Avoid extreme cold, maintain your nutrition, and most importantly, sustain this remarkable happiness you've found." The mind's influence on the body's healing capabilities is not to be underestimated. They returned to the cabin with renewed hope, making plans for improvements to the property, a larger garden, a proper barn, perhaps even an addition to the cabin itself. Zeke spoke of acquiring cattle in the spring, of building a ranch that could sustain them for years to come. "You're making plans for a future," Lillian observed one evening as they sat on the porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Our future," Zeke corrected, taking her hand. "One day at a time." As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of color to the aspen trees that dotted the hillsides, Lillian made an announcement that left Zeke speechless with joy and terror. "I'm with child," she said simply, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when you were trading at the fort." Zeke stared at her, a maelstrom of emotions crossing his face. "A baby, our baby," Lillian nodded, her expression a mixture of excitement and fear. "Due in early spring, he thinks. But your health is it safe for you to carry a child?" Zeke asked, voicing the concern that had immediately risen to the forefront of his mind. Doctor. Holloway says many women with consumption have successfully carried children, Lillian replied, though her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. He believes my current strength should see me through, provided I continue to take care of myself. Zeke pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Then we'll make sure you do exactly that. No more heavy lifting, no more long walks without rest. Lillian laughed softly against his chest. I'm pregnant, Zeke, not made of glass. You're carrying our miracle, he countered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not taking any chances. As the pregnancy progressed and Lillian's belly swelled with new life, Zeke became increasingly protective, much to her fond exasperation. He insisted on doing all the heavier chores, hired a woman from the settlement to help with housekeeping, and even built a more comfortable bed to accommodate Lillian's changing shape. When the first snow fell in November, Zeke watched Lillian anxiously for any sign that the colder weather was affecting her health. To his relief, the improvements in the cabin, better insulation, a more efficient stove, and a woodpile large enough to last through 3 winters kept her comfortable and warm. Stop hovering, she scolded him one evening, looking up from the baby blanket she was knitting. I'm fine, truly. Better than fine. I know, Zeke admitted, settling beside her on the sofa he'd traded for with a family moving further west. I just can't help worrying. Lillian set aside her knitting to take his hand, placing it on the swell of her abdomen where their child grew. Feel that? That's our baby, strong and healthy. A testament to how far we've come. As if in agreement, the baby kicked against Zeke's palm, drawing a startled laugh from him, strong just like its mother. Winter proved milder than the previous year, a blessing for which Zeke was profoundly grateful. Lillian experienced the usual discomforts of late pregnancy, but her lungs remained stable, the coughing spells infrequent and relatively mild. In February, exactly 1 year after Zeke had first brought Dr. Holloway to the cabin, Lillian went into labor. The midwife from the settlement arrived just in time, assisted by Dr. Holloway, who happened to be making his monthly visit. After 12 hours of labor, their daughter was born a healthy, robust infant with a shock of dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. They named her Sarah Hope, honoring both Zeke's sister and the emotion that had sustained them through their darkest days. She's perfect, Lillian whispered, cradling the swaddled infant as Zeke sat beside them on the bed, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. Our little miracle. One of many, Zeke agreed, pressing a kiss to Lillian's temple. Thank you for not giving up, for fighting so hard to stay with me. Lillian looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and joy. Thank you for believing when everyone else, including me, had lost hope. For promising me we would see the spring together. And look at us now, Zeke said, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at their daughter, a whole family to see this spring and many more to come. As March arrived, bringing with it the first tentative signs of another spring, Zeke stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Lillian rock their daughter on the porch. The past year had brought challenges, occasional setbacks in Lillian's health, the difficulties of caring for a newborn in the frontier, the constant vigilance required to maintain the precious remission. But it had also brought immeasurable joy. Lillian's strength had gradually returned, allowing her to care for their daughter with only occasional assistance. The ranch Zeke had dreamed of was beginning to take shape, with a small herd of cattle acquired through trade and hard work. And most importantly, they had each other, a family forged in the face of what had seemed like insurmountable odds. What are you thinking about? Lillian asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Zeke crossed to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as he gazed out at the landscape where the first wildflowers of the season were beginning to bloom. I was thinking about promises kept. About how sometimes, if you want something badly enough, if you fight hard enough, the universe listens. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Do you remember what you said to me last winter when I was at my weakest? I said a lot of things, Zeke admitted with a small smile. Most of them born of desperation and stubborn refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. You said, "We'll see the spring together," Lillian reminded him softly, and we did. And now we're seeing another one with our daughter. Zeke turned to look at her, taking in the healthy flush in her cheeks, the fullness that had returned to her once gaunt face, the light in her eyes that no disease had been able to extinguish. "And we'll see many more," he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss as the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the three of them in golden light, a family that had defied the odds, built on love that had proven stronger than death itself.